How intelligent people handle conflict. Conflict does not destroy relationships. Emotionally undisciplined reactions do. That distinction is not a minor one. It changes the entire frame through which conflict should be understood. If conflict itself were the problem, the solution would be avoidance. And avoidance is what most people practice. They step around difficult conversations. They absorb friction rather than address it. They learn to smile through tension and call that maturity. They wait for problems to dissolve on their own. And then they wonder why, over years, their relationships become shallower, their professional environments more political, and their internal life quieter in ways that do not feel like peace. Avoidance is not the intelligent response to conflict. It is the anxious one dressed as discipline. Most people fight to win. Intelligent people engage to position. This is a more important distinction than it might first appear. Fighting to win means your goal is to defeat the other person, to make them wrong, to make yourself right, to establish dominance through the sheer force of your argument or your emotion. It is a zero-sum orientation. And even when you win by this standard, you typically lose something else: credibility, rapport, the other person's willingness to engage honestly with you again. Engaging to position means something structurally different. It means your goal is not victory in this moment, but advantage over time. It means you are thinking not just about what is being said, but about what this exchange is establishing about you, about them, about the dynamic between you. It means you are managing the interaction rather than being managed by it. The person who can remain composed when pressured is not lucky. They are not cold. They are not detached from what matters. They are trained. The capacity to engage conflict with strategic clarity, to hear a challenge without flinching into defensiveness, to receive hostility without returning it automatically, to recognize manipulation without becoming its target. These are learnable skills. They operate through identifiable psychological mechanisms, and they can be developed systematically through the deliberate practice of precise internal habits. That is what this audiobook builds. Not confidence as a mood, not assertiveness as a style, not anger management as a coping tool. Strategic engagement as a discipline, emotional control as a competitive advantage, psychological composure as a structural feature of how you operate, not a state you occasionally achieve, but a default mode you have built through understanding and practice. By the time this audiobook is finished, conflict will look different to you. Not less real, not less significant, but structured, readable. Something you navigate rather than something that navigates you. That shift begins now. Introduction: conflict as an inevitable feature of strength. There is a narrative about conflict that is widely believed and almost entirely wrong. The narrative says that conflict is a sign of failure, that stable relationships don't have it, that emotionally mature people avoid it, that the goal of communication in any important relationship or environment is to maintain harmony, and that harmony means the absence of friction, the smooth agreement of aligned interests and compatible temperaments. This narrative is not just inaccurate, it is actively harmful to anyone who takes it seriously. Because what it produces is a relationship with conflict that is fundamentally passive. The person who believes conflict signals failure will avoid it whenever possible. And when it becomes unavoidable, we'll approach it with a kind of apologetic urgency and need to resolve it as quickly as possible, to smooth it over, to return to the surface appearance of harmony before understanding has actually been reached or agreement has actually been built. The accurate picture is considerably more demanding. Conflict is inevitable wherever two things or true interests differ, and the people involved are honest enough to acknowledge that they do. In any relationship with depth, professional, personal, collaborative interests will differ, perspectives will diverge, priorities will compete. This is not pathology. It is the natural consequence of distinct individuals with distinct experiences, goals and values engaging with shared circumstances. The person who never experiences conflict in their relationships should examine those relationships carefully. The most likely explanation is not exceptional compatibility. The most likely explanation is that one person has learned to suppress their actual perspective in the interest of maintaining the other person's comfort. That is not harmony. That is a power imbalance with a pleasant surface. Conflict, understood correctly, is a signal that something real is happening between two people. It is a signal that interests are present and are in contact with each other. It is a signal that communication is close enough to actual reality that real differences are becoming visible. It is, at its most productive, the mechanism through which two minds work out how to move forward when they don't start in the same place. The question is never whether conflict will occur. The question is what you do with it when it does. There is a second error that runs parallel to the first. If the first error is believing conflict signals failure, the second is believing that the appropriate response to conflict is emotional, that engaging fully means engaging with your full emotional weight, that passion and volume are evidence of genuine investment, that the person who cares most fights hardest. This error is seductive because it contains a grain of truth. Emotional investment in an outcome is real. The feelings that conflict produces are real. Anger, frustration, the sense of injustice, the desire to be understood, these are genuine human experiences that deserve to be acknowledged. But the presence of a feeling is not an instruction to act on it immediately. And this is precisely the confusion that costs most people so much in conflict situations. When you act from emotion in conflict, you are not displaying strength. You are displaying vulnerability. You are showing the other person exactly how to affect you, exactly which buttons move you, exactly where the unguarded openings are in your psychological architecture. You are handing them a map. The distinction between emotional engagement and strategic engagement is the central distinction of this entire audiobook. Emotional engagement says, I feel this, therefore I respond. Strategic engagement says, I feel this, I note it, and I choose what to do with it based on what serves my actual interests in this situation over the relevant time horizon. Emotional engagement is fast, it is immediate. It feels authentic because it is unfiltered. It also tends to be regretted. Strategic engagement is measured. It requires a brief but crucial internal process between stimulus and response. It may feel less satisfying in the immediate moment. It produces better outcomes over time. The third point of this introduction needs to be stated directly. Avoidance is not a sophisticated alternative to emotional engagement. It is not the disciplined choice of the person who has moved beyond reactive conflict. It is, in most cases, a different kind of weakness, one that wears a more respectable disguise. The person who avoids conflict believes they are maintaining stability. What they are actually doing is allowing unresolved tension to accumulate. They are deferring the cost of a difficult conversation by paying a different kind of cost: the slow erosion of clarity, the gradual accumulation of resentment, the increasing distance between what is said and what is meant. Avoidance also has a self-perpetuating quality. The longer a conflict is avoided, the more charged it becomes. The things that were not said 3 months ago have not simply disappeared, they have been annotated, revised, and inflated by the imagination. When the conversation eventually happens, and it will eventually happen, or the relationship itself will end, it arrives loaded with everything that was supposed to be said earlier and wasn't. None of this means every potential conflict deserves engagement. Some situations are genuinely not worth the energy. But that determination that this particular situation does not merit engagement is itself a strategic choice, made from a position of clarity and deliberate assessment. It is different in kind from avoidance, which is a reflexive retreat from discomfort rather than a calibrated assessment of what warrants investment. What this audiobook is building toward is a third option beyond emotional reaction and anxious avoidance. That option is strategic, composed, psychologically grounded engagement with conflict, the kind of engagement that does not flinch from difficulty, that does not amplify it unnecessarily, that reads the situation clearly, moves through it deliberately, and positions you better on the other side than you were before it began. This is not a natural skill for most people. It runs counter to some deeply embedded psychological tendencies that this audiobook will examine directly. Understanding those tendencies is itself part of the discipline, because you cannot manage what you cannot see. The chapters ahead will build this capacity one layer at a time. Begin with what conflict actually does to the mind. Chapter 1: The Psychology of Escalation. Conflict rarely begins at its worst point. It typically begins small: a comment that lands slightly wrong, a decision made without consultation, a tone that carries more dismissal than the speaker may have intended, a silence that the other person interprets as indifference. These are minor events in themselves. They carry limited weight. But they do not stay minor. They accelerate. And the mechanism that drives that acceleration is not the content of the disagreement. It is the ego. Ego in the context of conflict psychology does not mean arrogance. It means something more precise: the part of the self that monitors how the self is perceived, that tracks social standing and reputation in real time, and that treats challenges to its narrative about competence, about worth, about rightness as existential threats rather than simple differences of perspective. The ego is threat-sensitive in a way that is disproportionate to most actual threats. A mild challenge to an idea can register internally with the same urgency as a direct attack on character. A disagreement can feel like a dismissal. A criticism of a decision can feel like an indictment of the person who made it. This is not rational, but it is not surprising. The psychological systems that produce these responses evolved in environments where status and social belonging had survival implications, were being excluded from the group, or being publicly diminished in the group's estimation, carried genuine costs. The intensity of the ego's response to perceived threat is calibrated to that environment. not to a modern disagreement in a meeting room. What this means practically is that a significant portion of what happens in conflict is not actually about the stated subject of the conflict. Two people argue about a project timeline. The surface content is project planning. But beneath the surface, one person feels that their judgment is being questioned, and the other feels that their concerns are being dismissed. The ego of each person is defending something, an image, a narrative, a claim about themselves that the conflict seems to be threatening. This is why rational arguments so often fail to de-escalate conflict. You address the facts. The other person responds with more emotion. You offer evidence. They become more entrenched. You make a concession on the merits. They treat it with suspicion rather than relief. The facts are not the terrain. The ego is the terrain. Until you understand this, conflict will continue to confuse you. You will keep presenting rational arguments to people who are not, in that moment, operating in rational mode because their ego has taken over the session and isn't interested in reason. It is interested in vindication. The mechanism of escalation operates through what psychologists call reciprocal arousal. One person says something that the other person experiences as threatening or dismissive. The second person's stress response activates, heart rate increases slightly. Attention narrows, the part of the brain responsible for threat detection becomes more active. From this activated state, the second person responds. And that response, already colored by the physiological and psychological state it is coming from, tends to carry more intensity than the original provocation. Now the first person receives a response that is more intense than what they sent. Their ego registers the escalation. Their threat response activates more strongly. Their next response carries even more intensity. This cycle does not require malice from either party. It does not require either person to be unreasonable or aggressive by disposition. It requires only two people responding to each other's arousal states rather than to the content of what is being said. The result, after several exchanges, is a conflict that has separated entirely from its original subject and become a pure ego confrontation, two people defending themselves against each other, neither of whom can clearly recall what the original point was, both of whom feel entirely justified in their position. There is a psychological mechanism that makes this cycle especially resistant to interruption. It is called the fundamental attribution error, and it operates as follows. When you do something that upsets another person, you explain your behavior through context. I said that because I was tired. I reacted that way because the situation was stressful. My tone was sharper than usual because I had a difficult morning. Your behavior is the product of circumstances that, understood correctly, make your behavior entirely reasonable. When the other person does something that upsets you, you explain their behavior through character. They said that because they are disrespectful. They reacted that way because they are aggressive. Their tone was sharp because that is the kind of person they are. Their behavior is the product of who they are, not of circumstances, but of stable, fixed personality traits. This asymmetry, generous interpretation of your own behavior, dispositional interpretation of theirs, is not deliberate dishonesty. It is an automatic feature of human cognition, operating below conscious awareness, and it is extraordinarily difficult to correct in the heat of conflict, because the conflict itself is generating exactly the kind of emotional arousal that makes careful, nuanced thinking least available. The intelligent approach to conflict requires holding this mechanism in mind before the conflict begins. Not during is too late for most people. The heat of the moment is precisely when the fundamental attribution error is most active, most convincing, and most resistant to correction. The person who waits until they are in the middle of a heated exchange to remind themselves of contextual factors in the other person's behavior will find that reminder arriving too late to be useful. But the person who has internalized this understanding, who carries it as a settled piece of psychological knowledge rather than something they have to consciously recall, will find it available even in high carousel moments. They will notice the automatic impulse to explain the other person's behavior dispositionally, and will be able to pause that impulse long enough to ask what else might be true here. That pause, that brief, practiced interruption of the automatic interpretation is one of the most valuable tools in conflict management. It costs nothing in the moment. It prevents enormous waste over time. There is another dimension of ego dynamics in conflict that deserves direct examination. People in conflict are not primarily defending their position. They are defending their image of themselves as a certain kind of person. The person who insists, despite mounting evidence to the contrary, that their approach to a problem is correct, they are not protecting a belief about the problem. They are protecting a belief about themselves as someone with good judgment. To concede the point is not just to acknowledge an error in reasoning. It is to revise the image they carry of their own competence. The person who escalates in response to criticism of their work is not confused about whether the criticism might be accurate. They may at some level know it is accurate, but accepting it publicly would require a calibration of identity, a moment of standing in the space of "I was wrong about this," that the ego treats as unacceptable risk. Understanding this changes how you approach the other person in conflict. If they are defending their image, then any approach that forces a direct confrontation with the image, that requires them to publicly acknowledge error, or to concede in front of others, or to revise their stated position without a face-saving route, will be resisted intensely, not because the point is wrong, because the cost of conceding is psychological, and it is high. Intelligent engagement in conflict creates face-saving routes. It does not corner. It does not publicly expose. It does not score points at the expense of the other person's dignity. Because a person whose dignity has been threatened is not a person who can engage rationally with your argument. They are a person who is now focused entirely on protecting themselves, and anything you say becomes further evidence of your hostility rather than input they can process. This is not softness, it is precision. You are not protecting their feelings. You are removing the psychological obstacles to rational engagement. You are creating conditions under which productive conversation can actually happen rather than the surface appearance of conversation while two egos conduct a separate, entirely different exchange beneath it. Escalation, then, is a predictable cascade rather than an inevitable one. It follows from specific psychological mechanisms: ego threat, reciprocal arousal, attribution errors, image defense that can be understood in advance, recognized in motion, and interrupted before they carry the exchange to a place neither party actually wanted to reach. The interruption requires not strength in the conventional sense. It requires a specific kind of internal steadiness, the capacity to stay regulated while the other person is not, to think clearly while emotion is rising, to choose deliberately when the automatic response is pushing hard for immediate expression. How you develop that capacity is what the next chapter examines. Chapter 2: The Strategic Pause. Speed feels like strength in conflict. The quick comeback, the immediate rebuttal, the rapid-fire response that shows you have command of the material and are not rattled by the challenge. Speed signals confidence. It signals fluency. It signals that the other person has not landed a blow significant enough to require you to stop and think. This signal is false, and acting from it costs more than most people realize. The fastest response in conflict is almost always the most automatic one, and the most automatic response is the one generated from the activated state, from the ego that feels threatened, from the limbic system that is processing the exchange as adversarial, from the pattern recognition systems that have decided, based on previous experience, what this kind of situation means and what it requires. Automatic responses are fast precisely because they bypass deliberative thought. They do not require the slower, more effortful processing of the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for evaluating consequences, considering alternative interpretations, and making choices that reflect long-term interest rather than immediate impulse. They arrive ready-made, preformed, carrying the urgency of apparent necessity. And they are often wrong. Not factually wrong, necessarily, but strategically wrong. They say things that are true but unhelpful. They reveal vulnerabilities that didn't need to be shown. They escalate when de-escalation would have served better. They win the immediate exchange at a cost that only becomes visible later. The pause is not a hesitation, it is a tool. To understand why the pause is among the most powerful instruments available in conflict, you need to understand what it does to the dynamic between the two people involved. Most conflict operates according to a rhythm. A challenge is issued and a response is expected. The expectation of that response is itself a form of pressure, a push toward the automatic answer. The immediate engagement, the demonstration that you are present and not shaken. When you pause, when you receive what was said and do not immediately return fire, you disrupt that rhythm. The disruption is significant because rhythm, in conflict, is comfort for the aggressive party. The person who is escalating, who is pushing, who is applying pressure, they are operating within a familiar pattern. Challenge and response, escalation and counter-escalation. They know how this goes. They have done it before. The rhythm of it gives them confidence, because they believe they know what comes next. The pause removes the next thing they were expecting. And what replaces it is something they have to interpret, and that interpretation, in a charged situation, tends toward uncertainty. Silence applied deliberately in conflict functions as an information vacuum, and information vacuums make people uncomfortable in ways that are psychologically specific. The human mind has a strong drive toward coherence, toward understanding what is happening and predicting what will happen next. When that prediction is disrupted, when the expected response doesn't come, when the person across from you simply looks at you without reacting, the mind begins to work harder. It generates interpretations. It asks, what does this mean? Are they considering something I haven't thought of? Do they have information I don't have? Are they angrier than they appear? Are they more composed than I gave them credit for? These questions are not comfortable. They produce uncertainty. And uncertainty in a tense situation tends to erode the confidence of the person who was pushing. They begin to second-guess the attack. They may soften the position slightly without consciously deciding to. They may offer a clarification that partially walks back what was said. They may become aware, suddenly, of the fragility of their own position in a way they were not a moment ago. None of this requires you to say anything. The pause does the work. The strategic pause also gives you something the automatic response cannot access to your full cognitive capacity. When you are in an aroused state, when the stress response is active, when the ego is engaged, when the exchange feels urgent and adversarial, your thinking is genuinely impaired. Not metaphorically impaired, neurologically impaired. The resources available to your prefrontal cortex are reduced because other parts of the brain are drawing on the same physiological resources to handle what they have assessed as a threat. The practical result is that under stress, you are less creative, less able to see multiple perspectives simultaneously, less capable of identifying the most strategically useful response rather than just the most emotionally satisfying one. You are operating with a narrowed cognitive toolkit at precisely the moment when you most need the full range. The pause interrupts this. Even a brief pause, several seconds of not responding, of allowing the physiological activation to begin its natural return toward baseline, measurably improves access to deliberate cognition. The response you generate after a pause is not just more measured in its tone. It is structurally different in its content. It has been chosen rather than triggered. This leads to a practice that is simple to describe and requires consistent training to perform reliably under pressure. When you feel the urgency to respond immediately, when the automatic answer is forming and pushing for expression, that urgency is your signal to pause, not to think more slowly about the same thing, to actually stop, to breathe. To create a moment of internal space between what was said and what you will say. In that space, one question is worth asking: what does this situation actually require of me right now? Not what would feel satisfying to say. Not how do I demonstrate that I cannot be pushed around. Not how do I make them understand they are wrong. What does this situation actually require? That single question, asked from a space of momentary calm rather than a state of reactive urgency, produces dramatically different answers than the automatic response would have provided. Sometimes the answer is, I need more information before I respond. Sometimes it is, the most powerful thing I can do here is say less, not more. Sometimes it is, this is not the right moment for this conversation, and the most strategic choice is to name that and defer it. Sometimes it is simply, I was about to say something that would have made this worse, and I am glad I didn't. There is a version of the pause that works even within the moment of engagement, a micropause that does not require you to fall silent for an uncomfortable length of time, but still performs the same essential function. It looks like deliberation. It looks like you are thinking carefully about what was said, which is exactly what you are doing. It looks like measured consideration rather than either eagerness to respond or difficulty in responding. It communicates, without words, that you are someone who does not react automatically, who processes before speaking, who treats conversation with enough respect to actually think before contributing to it. This communicates something specific about who you are in the interaction. It positions you as thoughtful rather than reactive. And that positioning, accumulated over the course of an exchange, changes the relational dynamic. The person across from you adjusts often without realizing it to the kind of engagement that thoughtful, non-creative people tend to invite. They slow down, they become more considered themselves. The rhythm of the exchange, which was building towards something destructive, shifts. There is one more dimension of the strategic pause that deserves examination. The pause done well is not passive. It is not the absence of engagement. It is a form of active listening, the kind of listening that is focused not just on what the other person is saying, but on what they are revealing about their state, their position, their needs, and their actual concerns beneath the stated ones. Aggressive or defensive communication in conflict tends to be focused on itself. The person speaking is managing their own internal state as much as they are engaging with you. They are defending or advancing or demonstrating something. A great deal of what they say is not actually directed at you, it is directed at their own need to be perceived a certain way. From a state of calm, paused attention, you can hear what is actually being communicated beneath what is being said. And that information is more valuable than anything you could have said in the time you spent listening to collect it. Silence in conflict is never empty. It is always working. Chapter 3: Controlled Language. Words are the most precise tools available in conflict. They are also the most frequently misused. The most common misuse is volume, not volume in the literal sense of decibels, but volume in the communicative sense, saying too much, too quickly, with too little selectivity about what actually serves the purpose. Most people in conflict speak in a way that resembles a pressure release rather than a deliberate act of communication. The words come out because they need to come out, because the feeling behind them needs expression, because the internal pressure has built to the point where silence feels impossible, because speaking feels like doing something when staying quiet feels like surrender. The result is communication that is genuine but not strategic. It is honest in the sense that it reflects the speaker's actual state. It is ineffective in the sense that it often produces the opposite of what the speaker actually wants. Intelligent people in conflict speak less, and what they say is precise. This is not a stylistic preference. It reflects an understanding of how communication actually functions under conditions of tension. When a conversation is charged, everything that is said receives heightened scrutiny. The words are analyzed for intent, for subtext, for what they reveal about the speaker's position and vulnerabilities. Every sentence you produce is potential material. The person on the other side is not just listening, they are processing, interpreting, looking for openings. Volume of speech in this context is not persuasive. It is expensive. Every additional sentence is a new opportunity for misinterpretation, for providing ammunition, for saying something that will be remembered and used later. The impulse to explain yourself fully, to make sure the other person understands all of your reasoning, is understandable. It is also, in high-tension situations, often counterproductive. Less is not weaker. Less is more controlled. Less is harder to work with. Consider the difference between two responses to the same provocation. The first response is extensive. It explains the reasoning behind the contested decision in detail. It addresses objections that were not even raised. It pre-defends against criticisms that have not yet been made. It demonstrates familiarity with all the relevant factors and shows that careful thought went into the original choice. It goes on for several minutes. The second response says, I hear your concern. My position is this. Here is why. Which of these is stronger? The second, definitively, not because the reasoning in the first response is inferior, but because of what extensive explanation communicates in a charged interaction anxiety. The need to justify at length is read by most people at some level below conscious awareness as insecurity about the position. People who are genuinely confident in their stance do not tend to use many words to express it. They say what is true and stop. The extensive explanation is the speaker managing their own discomfort with being challenged. The brief, direct response is the speaker managing the interaction. Precision in language means something specific in conflict contexts. It means the word you choose names what is actually happening rather than what feels most convenient to say. It means the sentence does exactly what you need it to do, asks the question you need answered, establishes the boundary you need established, names the specific concern without sprawling into edgy sense, and then stops. Imprecise language in conflict tends to work against the speaker in several predictable ways. The first is that it provides the other person with more targets. A long, multi-part statement in a charged conversation invites selective engagement. The other person picks the weakest element, addresses only that, and ignores everything else. Your careful construction of multiple points becomes irrelevant because only the one vulnerable point is engaged. You end up defending the part of your argument that was least important. The second is that imprecise language tends toward inflammatory phrasing. When words are produced in volume under emotional pressure, some of them will be imprecise in ways that provoke. Absolute language always, never, every time. The only person who is almost always inaccurate and almost always raises the emotional temperature of the other person. Not because the characterization is deliberately hostile, but because it fails to reflect the actual complexity of the situation. The third is that extensive explanation often reveals more than you intended to reveal. In the effort to be fully understood, you disclose reasoning, concerns, and emotional states that give the other person strategic information they would not otherwise have had. You have shown your hand in an exchange where remaining somewhat opaque was a significant advantage. The discipline of controlled language has a structural component that is worth describing precisely. Before you speak in a charged conversation, know what your sentence is for, not what you feel like saying, what you are trying to accomplish with this particular sentence. Are you asking for information? Then ask the question and wait for the answer rather than embedding it in several paragraphs of framing. Are you establishing a position? Then state it directly, with brief but sufficient support, and do not invite a negotiation about whether the position is valid. Are you naming a concern? Then name it specifically and without the editorial commentary that turns a statement of concern into an accusation. Are you declining to engage with something? Then decline clearly and without the extended explanation that turns a boundary into a debate. Each of these purposes requires different language. The mistake most people make is not distinguishing between them, not knowing, as they begin to speak, what the words are for and producing instead a mixture that serves no single purpose well. Questions are among the most underused tools of controlled language in conflict. The person who speaks in statements in conflict is committed to a position. Every statement is a staking of ground, a flag planted that now has to be defended. The more statements you make, the more ground you have staked, and the more of the conversation's energy goes toward the defense of all that territory. The person who speaks in questions is gathering information. They are learning the other person's actual position rather than assuming it. They are discovering what specifically is driving the conflict rather than responding to what they imagine is driving it. They are also doing something strategically important. They are placing the burden of production on the other person. While the other person is talking, you are thinking. While they are producing output, you are analyzing it. Good questions in conflict have specific qualities. They are genuine, not rhetorical questions that are actually statements in question form, which tend to be experienced as contemptuous rather than curious. They are specific rather than broad. What specifically concerns you about this timeline? Rather than what is your problem with this plan? They do not contain embedded accusations or dismissals. They invite expansion rather than defense. And they reveal something about the person asking them. A person who asks good questions in a charged situation is demonstrating composure, intellectual confidence, and genuine engagement with the other person's perspective. These are all significant signals in a dynamic where signals are being read closely. There is a specific word pattern worth examining because it appears in many conflicts and consistently makes them worse. It is the yes, but construction. I understand your point. But that makes sense. But you may be right about that. But the but effectively negates everything that came before it. Whatever acknowledgement preceded the but is processed by the listener as a throat-clearing formality before the actual position is stated. They know you are not genuinely acknowledging their point because the but tells them so. The pattern has become so common in conflictual communication that it functions as a signal rather than as language, a signal that says, I am going to appear to hear you before I dismiss you. The more effective construction acknowledges genuinely when there is something genuine to acknowledge, and states your position separately rather than in opposition. Not I understand your concern, but my view is different. Simply I understand your concern. My view is different. Here is why. The period is the difference, not a conjunction that cancels the acknowledgement. A pause, a new sentence, and a clear statement of where you stand. Finally, there is the question of what not to say. In conflict, the words most urgently presenting themselves for expression are often exactly the ones that should not be spoken. The sharp observation about the other person's inconsistency. The history that could be invoked but won't help. The accusation that is accurate but would end the conversation rather than advance it. The dismissal that would feel satisfying for approximately 3 seconds before becoming a problem that outlasts the conversation. Choosing not to say these things is not weakness. It is a form of language control that is more demanding than anything that could be said because the demand is internal, not external. Nobody is stopping you from saying them. You are stopping yourself because you understand that the words that feel most urgently necessary in the moment are frequently the most strategically costly. The sentence that didn't get said cannot be misinterpreted. The sentence that didn't get said cannot be used against you. The sentence that didn't get said remains yours, a resource. Withheld, perhaps to be deployed later, perhaps to be recognized as unnecessary, but always a choice rather than an accident. That kind of restraint over language in conflict is one of the clearest demonstrations of psychological discipline available, and it is, to anyone paying attention, unmistakable. Chapter 4: Emotional Detachment in Real Time. Detachment is frequently misunderstood. In the context of conflict, detachment is not indifference. It is not the posture of a person who does not care about the outcome. It is not the removal of feeling from the equation. It is not coldness, and it is not the performance of neutrality by someone who is actually seething beneath the surface. Detachment, in the sense that is useful here, means the ability to observe what is happening, including what is happening inside you, without being fully absorbed by it. It is the capacity to have a perspective on the experience while you are inside the experience. To be in the conversation without being entirely of it. The distinction between fact and reaction is where this capacity lies. In any conflict, there are facts and there are your reactions to the facts. These two things feel fused in the moment. They seem to be the same thing. The immediate experience of what is happening, but they are not the same thing. They are two separate events occurring in sequence. Something happens, and then your mind and body respond to what happened. That sequence is extremely fast, so fast that the gap between them is usually invisible. But the gap is real. Facts are what was said, what was done, what is demonstrably true about the situation. Reactions are how those facts were interpreted, what threat they appeared to pose, what feelings they produced, what they seemed to imply about you and about the other person. The reaction is generated by the mind's interpretation of the fact, and that interpretation is shaped by history, by expectation, by current physiological state, by the accumulated weight of previous interactions with this person, by the particular vulnerability that this kind of challenge touches. The interpretation is not neutral. It is not simply the fact. It is the fact filtered through a complex and largely invisible psychological apparatus. Why does this distinction matter in practice? Because when you respond to your reaction as if it were the fact, you are responding to a constructed interpretation rather than to what actually happened. And constructed interpretations, generated under stress, tend to be skewed in specific ways toward threat amplification, toward hostile attribution, toward the worst available explanation of the other person's intent. The person who said something dismissive about your idea, did they intend contempt? Or were they speaking quickly and carelessly? You don't know. But your mind under stress has already decided. And it has decided in the direction that produces the most activation, the strongest defensive response, the most urgent sense that something must be done about this. Responding from that interpretation is responding to a story, not to what happened. And the story is wrong with enough frequency that acting on it automatically is a consistent source of problems. Detachment, applied here, means creating enough internal space to ask what actually happened, and what am I adding to it? The practice of observing rather than participating has a specific quality that is worth articulating carefully. To observe the conflict while being in it requires a kind of dual awareness. You are engaged, present, tracking what is happening in real time, and simultaneously you are noticing your own engagement with a degree of distance. You are watching yourself in the interaction, noting what you are feeling, where the feelings are coming from, what they are recommending, and whether those recommendations should be followed. This sounds demanding. It is at first. It becomes more available with practice, not because it becomes effortless, but because the habits of self-observation become more automatic, more integrated into the normal processing of difficult conversations rather than a separate effort running alongside them. One useful frame for developing this capacity is to imagine a version of yourself that is slightly above and to one side of the conversation, a quiet observer who is watching the exchange with interest, but without urgency. This observer is not threatened by what is happening. They are not required to defend anything or prove anything or win anything. They can simply note this is what is happening. These are the dynamics in play. This is what this person appears to be doing and why. This is what I am feeling and what I might be tempted to do about it. This frame is not a dissociation. It is a perspective-taking exercise, the deliberate practice of accessing a wider field of awareness than the reactive state naturally provides. Real-time emotional detachment also involves what might be called interest without investment. In most conflicts, the people involved are invested in the outcome, which is natural and appropriate. Outcomes matter. What happens in the conversation will have consequences. The investment is real. But investment has a cost in terms of perceptual accuracy. The person who is deeply invested in a particular outcome interprets ambiguous information in the direction of that outcome. They notice evidence that supports their position more readily than evidence that challenges it. They attribute significance to details that seem to confirm what they already believe and dismiss details that seem to complicate it. This bias is not correctable simply by trying to be objective. It operates below the threshold of conscious intention. But it can be reduced, though not eliminated, by deliberately separating the investment in the outcome from the assessment of what is actually happening. Interest without investment means you are fully engaged with what is happening, genuinely curious about what will emerge, attentive to every signal and shift in the exchange, but you have decoupled your emotional security from the specific outcome. You prefer certain outcomes to others. You are working toward them, but you are not in a state where losing them would be destabilizing. And that decoupling makes your perception more accurate, because it removes the systematic bias that investment introduces. There is a physiological component to emotional detachment in real time that is worth understanding because it gives you a practical lever to work with. The stress response, the fight or flight activation that conflict tends to trigger, has a physiological signature that you can learn to recognize in yourself. The increased heart rate, the tension in the jaw or shoulders, the narrowing of peripheral vision, the slight elevation in voice pitch, the feeling of heat, particularly in the face or chest. These signals are useful not because they tell you something is wrong, but because they tell you that your interpretive system has moved into activated mode, and activated mode is exactly when detachment is most needed and least naturally available. Recognizing the signals gives you a choice point that you would not otherwise have. Instead of moving from activation directly to response, you can interpose a moment of acknowledgement. I am activated. Something in this situation has triggered my stress response. That response may or may not be proportionate. I am going to take a breath before I continue. The breath is not metaphorical. The physiological act of taking a slow, controlled breath actually interrupts the escalation of the stress response. It signals to the nervous system that the situation does not require emergency mobilization. It gives the prefrontal cortex, the deliberative, Strategic part of the mind a fraction more time to participate in what happens next. That fraction is enough. There is a pattern that deserves specific attention because it is both extremely common and extremely costly. It is the pattern of making meaning from the other person's emotional state. When the other person becomes visibly upset, when their voice rises, when their words become sharper, when they display obvious agitation, there is a strong pull to interpret this display as evidence. Evidence that they are in the wrong and know it, or evidence that they are unstable and cannot be reasoned with, or evidence that this situation is more serious than you thought, or evidence that your position has struck something important. These interpretations may be partially correct. They are also likely to be incomplete. The other person's emotional display is, first and foremost, information about their emotional state, not necessarily about the merits of their position, the accuracy of their claims, or the significance of the underlying issue. The person who can observe the other's emotional display with clinical interest, noting it, noting what it might suggest, but not being moved by it in either direction, is operating at a distinct advantage. They are not threatened by the heat, because they have separated the heat from the content. And they are not fooled by it either, not lead to capitulate by the display of distress, and not lead to escalate by the display of aggression. Real-time emotional detachment is, in the end, a form of respect for the complexity of what is actually happening, for the possibility that your initial interpretation is incomplete, for the distinction between what you feel and what is true. It is also one of the most disorienting things you can do to someone who is trying to destabilize you. The person who expected their emotional intensity to land and produce a reactive response, who counted on your ego to engage, who designed their approach for a version of you that responds automatically, encounters instead someone who seems unaffected, not cold, not absent, but simply not where they expected the target to be. That encounter reconfigures the dynamic. It cannot be undone. The conversation continues, but from a different structure, and that structure favors the person who maintained their composure. Chapter 5: Power Without Aggression. The most common misunderstanding about power in conflict is that it requires volume. Volume meaning loudness, intensity, the forceful projection of certainty and authority, the raised voice, the dominant posture, the refusal to yield, the willingness to be more aggressive than the other person and to sustain that aggression until they yield. This is not power. This is noise, and like most noise, it is most commonly produced by people who are not sure their signal is strong enough to be heard without it. Genuine power in conflict is a structural quality, not a performative one. It does not require demonstration. It does not require constant assertion. It does not require the other person to acknowledge it. And it does not dissolve if they don't. It is not dependent on winning this particular exchange or making this particular point land or walking away with this particular agreement. Genuine power is the position from which you engage, not the behavior you deploy within the engagement. It is the settled sense, internal, not performed, that you understand the situation clearly, that you know your own interests and limits, that you have options, and that none of what is happening here has the power to destabilize who you are or what you know. From that position, you do not need to be loud. Loudness is for people who are not sure their message will arrive on its own. The dominant signal in conflict is not what most people think it is. Research on social dynamics, animal behavior, and human communication converges on the same observation: genuine high-status individuals tend to communicate with economy. They use fewer words, make slower movements, occupy space more calmly, and display less reactive urgency than lower status individuals. The expressiveness and intensity that we sometimes associate with dominance are, more accurately, the signals of someone fighting for a status they are not confident they possess. True authority communicates itself through what it does not need to do. The person who does not need to raise their voice to be heard is more powerful than the person who does. The person who can sit in silence after a challenge without needing to immediately fill the silence is more powerful than the person who rushes to respond. The person who can acknowledge being wrong without it costing them their composure is more powerful than the person who cannot. These are not behavioral tricks. They are not techniques to be layered over an internally insecure foundation. They are the natural expressions of a particular psychological state, one that takes time and genuine self-understanding to develop, but that once developed communicates itself without effort. Calm in a charged situation is itself a form of power, and it functions in a specific way. Most conflict has a temperature. The exchange heats up as the emotional activation of both parties increases. The assumption is that both parties will track the same temperature, that as one person escalates, the other will escalate to match. This matching is the norm. It is the expected pattern. It is what the architecture of the exchange is designed to produce. The person who declines to match the temperature does something structurally unusual. They introduce an asymmetry into a dynamic that was built for symmetry, and that asymmetry has specific effects. It slows the other person. When you remain calm while they escalate, their escalation starts to look different to themselves as much as to you. The heat they are projecting is landing on a cool surface and not being returned. The conflict, which was building toward mutual escalation, has stalled, and the stall creates a moment of recognition: I am doing this alone. That recognition is uncomfortable. It makes the escalating behavior visible to the person performing it in a way it wasn't before. Most people, given a moment of that visibility, will moderate, not because they have been persuaded that they were wrong, but because continuing to escalate into composure is effortful and, eventually, embarrassing. Maintaining calm under genuine pressure is not the same as appearing calm. The distinction matters because it determines whether the calm is sustainable. Appearing calm, managing your external presentation while your internal state is highly activated, is a short-term tactic that is exhausting to maintain and that tends to collapse under sustained pressure. The performance requires constant effort, and that effort is itself a resource drain that leaves less capacity for clear thinking, careful language, and strategic decision-making. Genuine calm is different in kind. It is the product of the work described throughout this audiobook: the trained capacity to stay regulated, to interrupt automatic responses, to create the internal space between stimulus and reaction. It does not require performance because it is not a performance. It is a state imperfect, requiring active maintenance, not invulnerable to sufficient pressure, but genuinely more stable than the reactive baseline. The difference in what these two produce is significant. The person appearing calm has to manage two things: the conflict and their own performance. The person genuinely calm has to manage only the conflict. Aggression in conflict. The loud, forceful, intimidating variety operates by occupying the other person's attention with your state rather than your content. When someone is aggressive toward you, the first thing you notice is the aggression. It commands attention. It activates your own stress response. It pulls your focus toward managing the emotional dynamic rather than engaging with the substance of the exchange. This is, in some contexts, intentional. The aggression is deployed precisely to prevent substantive engagement, because substantive engagement would not favor the aggressive party. Non-aggressive power declines this game. It declines to make the emotional dynamic the focus. It holds steady on the substance, the actual content, the specific claims, the real questions at issue, even while the other person is trying to make the temperature the primary event. This requires a quality that might be called selective attention, the capacity to notice the aggression, to register it, to take it into account without giving it the primary claim on your cognitive resources, to hear it as one piece of information about the situation rather than as the most urgent thing in the room. This is a trained capacity. It does not come automatically. The human nervous system is built to treat aggression as a high-priority signal, as something that demands an immediate response, either defensive or counter-aggressive. Declining to give it that priority is a deliberate act of cognitive override, and like all such acts, it becomes more reliable with practice. There is a specific form of power without aggression that deserves its own attention: the power of named precision. Named precision is the capacity to describe, with calm and accuracy, what is happening in the conflict, including the behavior of the other person, without emotional loading, without accusation, and without flinching. When someone is being manipulative in a conflict using emotional pressure, distorting facts, creating false urgency, making implicit threats, the temptation is to respond to the content of what they are saying rather than to the structure of what they are doing. You engage with the argument when you should be naming the move. Naming the move looks like, I notice you're framing this as if there are only two options when there are clearly more. Or I notice the timeline pressure here is being presented as external when it's actually a choice. Or I notice this conversation has shifted from the original issue to something else, and I'm not sure why. These are not accusations. They are observations specific. Calm, accurate observations about what is structurally happening in the exchange. And they are profoundly destabilizing to the person doing the thing being named, because they demonstrate that the move has been seen. The tactic that depends on not being visible has been made visible. People who use pressure tactics in conflict, whether consciously or not, depend on those tactics working below the level of explicit recognition. Named precision removes that invisibility, and once a tactic is visible, it tends to stop working. The person using it has to either acknowledge it, abandon it, or escalate in a way that makes them look worse than they did before. All of this rests on a foundation that is worth stating directly. Power without aggression is not available to people who need something from the conflict that only the other person can give them. If you need their approval, you cannot be powerful in the exchange because your need gives them the leverage. If you need to be right, you cannot be powerful because any challenge to your position becomes a threat. If you need the relationship to return to comfort immediately, you cannot be powerful because you will sacrifice strategic positions to achieve the emotional comfort you are unable to tolerate not having. Power in conflict requires a specific kind of internal freedom from the emotional dependencies that make you manipulable. This is not freedom from caring. You can care deeply about the outcome of a conflict and still be free from the specific emotional need that would hand control of the exchange to the other party. Developing that freedom is the slow work of building an identity that does not depend on external validation to maintain its stability. It is the work of knowing what you stand for, understanding your own limits, developing trust in your own judgment, and cultivating enough internal resources that no single relationship or conversation carries your entire sense of self. When that foundation is present, something becomes possible in conflict that is difficult to describe but immediately recognizable when you encounter it. The person who has it does not need the other person to yield for the interaction to have been worthwhile. They are not diminished if the other person doesn't concede. They are not shaken by aggression or by manipulation, or by the refusal to acknowledge something that is clearly true. They engage from a place that is not contingent on what the other person does with the engagement. That quality, genuine non-contingency in conflict, is the clearest possible signal of psychological strength, and it is among the most effective tools available, because there is nothing to push against. The lever the other person expected to use is not there. Chapter 6: When to exit. Not every conflict deserves your engagement. This is a statement that requires some care to make, because it can be mistaken for its less sophisticated relative, the belief that avoiding conflict is generally wise, that stepping back is the mature choice, that picking your battles is synonymous with knowing which battles are worth fighting. The statement being made here is not about avoidance. It is about strategy, and it is, in many ways, more demanding than engagement because it requires the kind of clear-eyed assessment of a situation that strong emotion makes genuinely difficult. The question is never whether you could win a conflict. Often you could. The question is whether winning this conflict serves your actual interests and whether the concept of winning is even the right frame for what is happening. Consider the conflict that is designed to provoke you, where the other party's goal is not to reach understanding or resolve a genuine dispute, but to draw you into a posture that costs you something: composure, credibility, time, or relational capital. The conflict that is, in essence, a trap. Engaging with this kind of conflict, even skillfully, even from a position of genuine psychological composure, involves a cost. You are spending resources, attention, energy, emotional capital on something that was not offered in good faith. Even a flawless performance leaves you with slightly less than you had before the exchange began. The strategic exit from this kind of conflict is not a retreat. It is the recognition that the cost-benefit calculation does not favor engagement, and the discipline to act on that recognition even when staying and fighting would feel more satisfying. How do you recognize when a conflict is not worth engaging? Several patterns tend to characterize these situations. The first is a consistent asymmetry in the stakes. You care significantly about the outcome, the other party does not, or cares primarily about the fight rather than the resolution. In this situation, you are the one with something to lose. They are not. You are bearing most of the risk of the exchange. They are bearing almost none. This is not an environment where your strategic skills compensate for the structural disadvantage. It is an environment where the most intelligent move is to decline to play. The second pattern is a fundamental incommensurability of worldview that no amount of skillful communication will bridge in this interaction. There are positions so deeply held, so tied to identity, so protected by accumulated reinforcement, that a single conversation, regardless of how well conducted, will not move them. This does not mean the position is correct or that it should be indefinitely left unchallenged. It means that this particular moment, with this particular exchange, is not the leverage point. The third pattern is the bad faith interlocutor, the person who is not engaging with the actual content of the conflict, but using the appearance of engagement to pursue other goals. These goals might include making you look bad in front of observers, extracting information you would not otherwise share, documenting your responses for later use, or simply gaining the social satisfaction of having provoked a reaction. With this person, substantive engagement is largely pointless, because the substance is not what the conversation is actually about. Recognizing these patterns is itself a skill, and it is impeded by precisely the emotions that conflict generates. When you feel challenged, the natural pull is toward engagement. The ego wants to demonstrate that it cannot be pushed around. The sense of injustice wants the record corrected. The desire to be understood wants expression. These are natural impulses. They are not always strategically sound. The person who can look at a conflict situation while inside it, while feeling its pull, and ask a genuinely honest question about whether engaging serves their interests, has developed a specific kind of psychological discipline. They have learned to operate from a level of awareness that is not immediately accessible to the reactive self. This requires practice. It requires previous experience of engaging conflicts that weren't worth engaging, and paying attention to what that cost. It requires developing a more refined sense of what your real interests are in a given situation, as opposed to what your immediate emotional state presents as your interests. When you do choose to exit strategically, deliberately, from a position of assessment rather than avoidance, the manner of exit matters considerably. The exit that preserves your position is the one that does not announce itself as retreat. It is the exit that reframes the conversation, that names what you are doing without explaining it defensively, that leaves the door open for future engagement if that future engagement becomes warranted. This is not that difficult to do once you are clear about what you are choosing and why. The difficulty comes from the internal pressure, the ego's resistance to being seen as backing down, the discomfort of leaving a challenge without having fully addressed it, the sense that silence is concession. None of these things are true. Strategic silence is not concession. Deferring a conversation is not losing it. Declining to engage a provocation is not yielding to it. But these truths have to be internalized, made part of how you understand conflict and what it means before they are available in the heat of an actual situation. There is another dimension to this chapter that concerns not the individual conflict, but the pattern of conflict across a relationship. Some relationships have a conflict pattern that is, in its structural totality, not worth engaging, not because any single conflict is obviously pointless, but because the cumulative pattern of interactions, the way conflict moves, rears, escalates, and resolves, is one that consistently costs more than it produces. Recognizing this pattern is difficult for several reasons. First, because in most relationships, the individual conflicts seem addressable. If you just communicate better, if the other person just understood, if the specific issue were resolved. The focus on the specific issue obscures the pattern. Second, because relationships carry sunk costs, investment of time, emotion, shared history that make it psychologically difficult to assess their current and future value clearly. The sunk costs are not a reason to continue investing, but they function emotionally as if they were. Third, because exiting a relationship is a larger, more consequential decision than exiting a single conflict, and the gravity of that decision tends to produce hesitation and repeated re-engagement. One more conversation, one more attempt to resolve the underlying dynamic that can extend the pattern far beyond the point where a clear-eyed assessment would have ended it. The question of whether a conflict pattern deserves continued engagement is ultimately a question about what a relationship is costing versus what it is providing, and whether that ratio is likely to change through the means available. This assessment should be made, as much as possible, from a state of calm rather than from the peak of a particular conflict. In the immediate aftermath of a difficult exchange, assessment is likely to be either too generous, you want to restore connection, so you minimize how bad it was, or too severe, the pain of the moment colors everything that came before it. A clearer assessment comes from a longer view over the course of months or years. Is this relationship producing more than it costs? Is the trajectory improving or worsening? Are the conflicts resolvable in ways that actually change the underlying pattern? Or do they recur in essentially the same form? The final point in this chapter is about the most sophisticated form of strategic exit, the one that transforms the decision not to engage into a source of advantage rather than simply a neutral conservation of resources. When you decline to engage a conflict calmly, clearly, without hostility or explanation, you communicate something. You communicate that you have assessed the situation and determined that your engagement is not required, that the challenge, or the provocation, or the demand does not meet the threshold for your response, that you are selective rather than reactive. This is, to anyone paying attention, a signal of confidence, not the performed confidence of someone who is acting unconcerned. The structural confidence of someone who genuinely is unconcerned because they understand the situation clearly enough to know that engagement is not what this moment requires of them. That signal, read correctly by the other person, often does more to shift the dynamic than any argument you could have made within the conflict itself. What you chose not to do has redefined what you are. Closing conflict reveals structure, not emotion. There is something that becomes visible in conflict that is invisible almost everywhere else. Not character in the loose popular sense of the word. Character is visible in many contexts in how someone treats people who can do nothing for them, in the consistency between what they say and what they do, in the choices they make when no one is watching. These are real and meaningful measures. What conflict reveals specifically is structure. The structure of how a person has organized their internal life, their sense of who they are, their relationship to being challenged, their capacity to maintain cognitive clarity under emotional pressure, the gap or the absence of a gap between what they feel and what they do. Most people approach conflict trying to hide structure. They manage their presentation. They control the visible expression of their internal state. They work to appear more composed, more certain, more in command of the situation than they actually are. And this approach produces a specific and ironic result. Because the effort of concealing the internal state of performing composure over a foundation of anxiety, or performing certainty over a foundation of insecurity, is itself a form of structural exposure. The performance is visible to anyone who knows what to look for. As performance, the tightness of the presentation reveals what it is trying to contain. The alternative is not to expose yourself freely and without discipline. The alternative is to build a structure that does not need concealment because it does not produce what needs to be concealed. This is the work that this audiobook has been describing throughout. Understanding escalation not just as a pattern that happens to you, but as a predictable cascade driven by identifiable mechanisms changes your relationship to conflict before it begins. You enter difficult situations with a map of the terrain rather than being surprised by its features. The strategic pause practiced until it becomes more available than the automatic response changes the timing of everything. Between what happens and what you do about it, there is now a reliable moment of choice. That moment is where your intelligence can participate. Controlled language, the discipline of knowing what each sentence is for. The practice of economy, the recognition that less is often more precise and more powerful, changes what you introduce into the conflict. You are no longer adding to the noise. You are adding signal selectively and with purpose. Emotional detachment, not the absence of feeling, but the capacity to observe your feeling from a position slightly above it, changes the information available to you in the moment. You are receiving data about the situation rather than being consumed by the situation. The difference in what you can do with that data is significant. Power without aggression, the quiet, structural authority that does not require demonstration because it does not require acknowledgement, changes how the conflict is received. The person across from you is no longer engaging with a reactive surface. They are engaging with something more difficult to maneuver against, composure that is genuinely present rather than performed. And strategic exit, the knowledge of when engagement serves and when it does not, changes the frame of the entire endeavor. You are no longer obligated to respond to every provocation, to engage every conflict, to prove yourself in every exchange. You are selecting, and selection is a form of power. The person who has internalized these capacities relates to conflict differently at the most fundamental level. They do not dread it. They are not comfortable with it in the way that people who enjoy conflict are comfortable, the kind of comfort that comes from addiction to the activation, from the stimulation of the fight, from needing to have an adversary. They are comfortable with it the way a skilled professional is comfortable with a demanding aspect of their work. It is not pleasant necessarily. It does not have to be, but it is not threatening. It is workable. It is something they have the tools to navigate. This relationship with conflict changes what conflict reveals about them. When they are challenged, they do not flinch. Not because they are suppressing the instinct to flinch, but because the challenge is not landing on an exposed nerve. The challenge is landing on structure. Structure is what you have built over time through the consistent practice of the habits described in this audiobook. It is the result of hundreds of small moments when you paused instead of reacted, when you spoke precisely instead of extensively, when you observed your own emotional state rather than being governed by it, when you chose strategic restraint over immediate expression. None of those moments was dramatic. None produced a visible transformation. The practice is, as all genuine training is, quiet and cumulative rather than sudden and spectacular. But the accumulation is real, and over time, it produces a person who is structurally different from the person who began the practice. Not different in the sense of changed beyond recognition. The same person, same history, same values, same range of emotional experience, but operating from a different place. Conflict will continue to be part of your life. This is not a failure of skill or of character. It is the natural consequence of living among other people who have their own interests, their own perspectives, their own histories, and their own blind spots. The world does not become frictionless because you have become more skilled at moving through friction. What changes is this: the friction no longer determines the direction. You do. Not through force, not through volume, not through the performance of strength that is really the signaling of anxiety. Through the quiet, consistent application of psychological precision to situations that most people navigate through emotion alone. There is a final observation worth making about the way conflict functions in the context of your longer development. Every conflict you navigate well, every exchange where you maintained composure, chose language deliberately, managed your own state, and moved through the difficulty without being significantly moved by it, adds to a body of evidence about who you are. That evidence is not primarily visible to others. It is visible to you, and the self-knowledge that accumulates from that evidence is qualitatively different from the self-knowledge that comes from performance or from external validation. It is not the sense that you appeared strong. It is the sense that you were. Over time, that evidence becomes the foundation of an identity that is stable in conflict because it has been built in conflict. Not hypothetically, not in theory, actually in real exchanges with real stakes under real pressure. Conflict does not destroy relationships. Emotionally undisciplined reactions do. Most people fight to win. Intelligent people engage to position. And now you understand the difference. Conflict reveals structure, not emotion. The structure is yours. Build it accordingly.